fellow city groups, we have reached the place in the Gospel according to Mark where we are seeing increasing conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders and the religious establishment. And in fact, today we're going to see the religious leaders want to kill Jesus after he heals someone. And all of this is going to take place, at least for today, in the context of discussing the Sabbath and Jesus' interactions around the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath is Saturday, it's not Sunday, and we'll get into why we worship on Sunday in a little bit. But first, let's look at the Old Testament and what it has to say about the Sabbath. Briefly, it said you couldn't work, you couldn't leave your house, you couldn't make a fire. And if you broke these restrictions, it was punishable by death. So don't go out and pick up sticks. You might be put to death. Now, why is this? Well, we see this in Deuteronomy. You are to work and do all your tasks in 6 days. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. On that day, you must not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male slave, your female slave, your ox, your donkey, any other animal, or the foreigner who lives with you, so that your male and female slaves, like you, may have rest. Recall that you were once slaves in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there by strength and power. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So what we see is, back all the way in Deuteronomy, when the law was given a second time, it's put in terms of, this is what you do because you are my people. So God is making an agreement, a covenant, with Israel. And so the Sabbath is part of this, and the restrictions on the Sabbath are a part of that. But they're put in the context of doing this because of what God has done for them and bringing them out from Egyptian captivity. He has made them his people, and as a result, this is one of the things he expects from them. Now, this is also for their good, right? So you're being forced to take a day off. That's a good thing. But what we're going to see in Mark today is that the Pharisees missed the heart and intent of the Sabbath command, and that we, as New Testament Christians, are not under that command in the letter, but there is a good principle that we should apply to our lives. So, what we see here in Mark chapter 2 is that after being questioned, Jesus says the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Now, he's saying this in response to the Pharisees being upset that his disciples plucked the heads off of some wheat and ate them. And Jesus' point here is that the Sabbath was created for man to rest and worship. And so people being hungry, that's a human need. And so another point he's making is that human needs come before religious ritual. Now, they come before ritual, but not before other moral commands. So I'm not trying to make the point here that all of the law is gone and we can just place people in how we think they should be treated over and above what God has explicitly commanded. That's not my point. The contrast here is between religious ritual and human needs. And it's worth pointing out that the Old Testament law didn't say you couldn't eat food or pluck grain in that way. That wasn't considered work. This was something that had been added later by Jews trying to figure out, how do we apply this Sabbath? And so they added so many more laws and rules that God didn't initially give. So Jesus' point here in Mark 2, before we move on to Mark 3, is that the Sabbath was created for man, and that he is Lord of the Sabbath. That the Sabbath finds its fulfillment in him. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But moving on to Mark chapter 3. The Pharisees are watching to see if Jesus will heal a man's hand. That's how far this has gone. That's how low they have sunk. They are waiting to see if he's doing a good thing so they can catch him. That's incredibly upside down. But what this points to is that the religious leaders knew Jesus could heal. They weren't unconvinced of his power. They knew he could do it. And so what we see is the revelation of Jesus' authority had hardened them. It hadn't softened them to his message. And this is something we still see today. Sometimes God's revelation, when it's clearly proclaimed, when it is unavoidably seen, hardens some people and softens others. The Reformer said, the same sun that hardens the clay melts the ice. And so we see this still today. But they knew he could heal. Jesus also knew they were waiting for him. And yet what does he do? This is the only place in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus heals without first being approached. He wasn't trying to hide. He knew they were waiting to catch him, and he heals anyways to demonstrate his power and his might and his authority over the natural world. Once again, we've seen this trend over and over and over again. And this is what he says in verse 4. He said to them, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or evil, to save a life or to destroy it?" Well, the obvious answer, right, is yeah, it's lawful to do good. But this is once again reinforcing his earlier point from chapter 2. Human need comes before religious ritual. And isn't it interesting that they go out and plot to kill him after he heals a man, after he does good? He didn't do any work, he spoke it. And I think this all the more illustrates that he threatened their established religious authority. They did not like this. They weren't upset that he healed someone. They were upset that their authority was being questioned. Well, all of this leaves us with the question, now what? Well, what does this mean for us? What does it mean that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath? What does it mean that we don't put ritual before people? How does this fit in our life? Well, the first thing I want to say is that Christians, New Testament Christians, as people who have been redeemed by Christ, are not under the old covenant. That was an explicit agreement with God and Israel. And so we see Paul saying in Romans 14, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. There isn't a special day anymore for the Christian. It's not Saturday, which was the Sabbath. It's not Sunday. However, we do see that Christians established the practice and tradition of worshiping on the first day of the week, which would be Sunday, after Jesus' resurrection. We see this very early on in Acts. And so there is a good principle in setting aside a day to worship, in setting aside a day to rest. God knew what he was doing when he instructed Israel to rest, when he even said, your servants, your animals, your slaves need rest. He knows how we work because he made us. Now, many of us here in America have 2 days of rest. We have Saturday and Sunday. But I don't think, even in spite of the fact that we may be formally off work, that we actually rest. We fill up our lives so much that we don't find soul and physical rejuvenating rest. And that doesn't mean just sitting down and staring at the TV, right? One of the things we were created to do is cultivate and bring order. And so if you work at a desk, maybe that looks like cultivating a garden. If you're out all the time, maybe it looks like reading for you, studying, reading your Bible, praying, spending time with your family. The Sabbath is a principle we can apply, but it's not a day we're bound by. And more than that, instead of finding rest in a day now, we find rest in a person, in the person of Christ. Because whereas the Sabbath provided only rest for the physical body, what the Christian has found is ultimate gospel soul rest in Jesus. We aren't needing to strive anymore to live up to a standard we will never reach. We aren't searching for the answers in life to the biggest questions. We have found those in the person of Christ. We have been credited with righteousness. We have been told the oracles and the mysteries of God in his word. And so we find true rest in Jesus. We enter into that rest with him. But there is a practical side to this where we still need to set aside time to strengthen our relationship with Jesus, to go to his word and learn what it says, and to still provide for our physical rest as our Creator knew we needed.